Hi, I'm Jamie Cohen with Cohen & Broche Law Offices. I want to talk to you today about family immigration to the United States. There's many opportunities for close members of a U.S. citizen's family, and in some cases even the close relatives of a green card holder in the United States to actually immigrate to the U.S. as a green card holder. So what is this, essentially? Basically, family immigration, probably the most common one, is an individual, foreigner, is married to a U.S. citizen. Now that they could be living abroad, they could be living in another country, or they could be living in the United States. The procedure is actually different depending on the situation. But let's assume that the spouse of the U.S. citizen is living overseas. So what's supposed to happen? Well, basically, the U.S. citizen spouse applies for his or her spouse to immigrate to the United States to receive a green card. It's essentially a three-step process. The first step is the U.S. citizen actually files with the U.S. Immigration Service, known as USCIS. They file a lot of papers, documents, things like that, to show that the marriage is legitimate. That's really the fundamental issue when it comes to family immigration with spouses, is to show that the marriage is legitimate. It's not like a fraudulent marriage just for the purpose of getting a green card, because the government does look at that quite closely. So the U.S. citizen files the paperwork, and then it takes quite a bit of time, several months, sometimes even up to a year these days. And then once the case is approved, the case is then transferred to another government agency called the National Visa Center. And at that point, the attention of the government turns to the foreigner, person living outside the United States or the non-U.S. citizen, asks a lot of questions, a very lengthy questionnaire about everything about that person, plus requires a lot of documentation, including their passport, their birth certificates, marriage certificates, former divorce certificates that they've been married before, if they've served in the military, police background checks. There's a lot of issues, because one of the big issues is security checks for the United States. Finally, when all of that is provided, all that information is provided to the National Visa Center, the case is then transferred to the local embassy that handles the case. And at that point, an interview is scheduled for the foreign spouse. And just before the interview, they're supposed to get a fairly extensive medical exam, and then they have their interview. And again, if the interview is overseas, it's usually fairly mild, as long as you can prove that the marriage is legitimate. It's a fairly mild kind of situation. And then the foreigner leaves their passport there, they're approved, they get it back in a couple of weeks, and they can enter the U.S. with an immigrant visa, allowing them to work immediately. Functions as basically as a temporary green card for a period of time. So that's until they get their permanent green card. So that's the way it works for spouses who live overseas. Now, spouses who live in the United States, in other words, let's say the U.S. citizen marries a foreigner in the U.S. and they live in the U.S. Now it's a little bit more complicated. Obviously, you're not dealing with the embassies, you're not dealing with the National Visa Center, everything's going through the U.S. Immigration Service. It's a much slower process, to be honest, and it's also a much more intensive process, because the final interview with the spouse, with the foreign spouse, and then also the U.S. citizen, is quite intrusive, or it can be quite intrusive, because they become suspicious that the marriage is not legitimate. And so here, the couple needs to really be prepared for some difficult questions, making sure that they can prove the legitimacy of marriage. Anyway, that gives you kind of an overview of the spouse visa. There's also similar visas for minor children of American citizens. So if you're under the age of 21, it's very similar to the spouse, very similar to everything that I explained. It's pretty straightforward. But a U.S. citizen can also apply for adult children, those over the age of 21, and or brothers and sisters, and in which cases, these cases, again, they operate the same way as what I explained with the spouse, but it's a much slower process. It's not, these people are not considered to be immediate relatives. They are on a backlog system. Sometimes it can take up to 12, 13, 14 years for the cases to be processed. So that's a general idea of what ends up happening. Finally, some green card holders, or green card, I shouldn't say some green card holders have also limited availability to petition for their spouses and also for their minor children. There's always, if you're a green card holder married to a foreigner, then you can also apply for them, but there's going to be a waiting list, usually a couple of years, before that person is eligible to move to the United States. But that gives you an idea, the general ideas behind family immigration. And if you have questions, if you want some assistance, please let us know at Cohen & Broach Law Offices, and we will be happy to help you. Thank you very much.